Beethoven's Fourth Symphony has inspired countless thousands of musicians since it was first performed more than 2 centuries ago. Yet few, it's safe to say, have risked arrest and prison time just to play this magnificent piece of music. Enter the Ramallah Orchestra, made up largely of Palestinian musicians in their teens and 20s, accompanied by 15 or so visiting teachers and performers from Europe and the US. The orchestra is a project of Kamandjati, the Ramallah-based music school. For the Palestinians in the orchestra, Beethoven's music makes up only part of the story. The concert venue was in the Old City of Jerusalem, a holy place embedded deep inside the collective dreams and history of the Palestinians, yet denied them by a combination of bureaucracy and concrete. For the Jerusalem concert, some of the musicians had managed to obtain the permits Israel allows for special occasions. But on this hot summer day in Palestine, 5 members of the orchestra were not so lucky. To play with their orchestra in the Holy City, the musicians would resort to the otherwise unthinkable, climbing over the separation wall. Their journey started in the early afternoon, in the stone and copper courtyard of Kamandjati's headquarters in Old Ramallah. 3 dozen young Palestinian musicians and visiting accompanists climbed aboard a tour bus, instrument cases slung over their shoulders, renewing an annual Jerusalem ritual. For Palestinians, Jerusalem is becoming an imaginary city. Though barely 20 kilometers separate Ramallah from the walls of the Old City, reaching Jerusalem is increasingly less a physical journey than an exercise of the mind and spirit. The city has been effectively sealed off by massive physical and bureaucratic barriers, while ironically being declared united by Israel, the authority in control during this period of the city's 5,000-year history. To prove that, Israel's Minister of Public Security recently shut down a children's theater festival and puppet show at the Hakawati, East Jerusalem's Palestine National Theater, because the festival had allegedly received funds from the Palestinian Authority. The PA is confined to the West Bank, but its position, backed in word if not in deed by the most of the world's nations, remains that East Jerusalem should be the capital of a sovereign nation called Palestine. A trip in 2 worlds. Now the lucky permit holders of the Ramallah Orchestra would be reconnected, if only for a few hours, with their holy city. Al-Quds, the Arabic name for Jerusalem, means the holy. But the 5 musicians, one of the orchestra's 4 violists, both of its timpani players, one of the double bass players, and a gifted violinist, had been told they would need the magnetic identification cards Israel is implementing for its permit regime. According to Kamandjati's director Ramzi Abudwan, who went to apply, they said, "We don't have the magnetic cards until July 10, days after the concert." "It's f***ing crazy," Ramzi said. In an orchestra of only 37 people, the contributions of these 5 musicians was vital. If the Ramallah 5 couldn't participate, Ramzi said, he would cancel the concert. The bus arrived at Kalandia military checkpoint, an exhaust-choked border crossing where hot, fuming drivers jockeyed for position, funneling into a single line before submitting for inspection. Vendors selling kebab, tissue packets, pillows, bottles of water and verses from the Quran weaved through the knots of vehicles and the plastic litter and chunks of broken concrete. The bus inched forward. Here, where the massive wall separates Ramallah from Jerusalem, the Ramallah 5 would try Plan B, sit in the back of the bus, hoping the soldiers would somehow get lazy and check only the foreign passports and approved permits. As part of this plan, musicians holding the proper documents were strategically placed towards the front of the bus. 3 Israeli soldiers came on board, their American-made M16s rifles slung around their shoulders, and began their inspection. One of them, baby-faced, with honey blonde hair, appeared to still be in high school. The soldiers checked the passports in the front row, then conferred, apparently discussing whether to check the whole bus. After some barked orders from a radio clipped to one of the soldiers' uniforms, they moved toward the back. Plan B, it appeared, was not going to work. Within minutes nearly all of the Palestinians, even the ones holding proper papers, had been ordered off the bus. Permits or not, they would not be allowed to cross the checkpoint in relative dignity, like the foreigners who remained on the air-conditioned bus. Instead, they would walk past the red metal benches of the passenger lounge, surrounded on three sides by blue vertical bars, then pass down a long corridor of silver bars, akin to a cattle chute on a western ranch, except for at the end, they would be required to move through multiple 2-5-meter high turnstiles, before ending up jammed with dozens of other Palestinians in front of yet another blockade. Opus in the sun. The bus waited on the other side. Montasser Jebrani, a Palestinian clarinetist now studying in France, was riffing on the hot pavement, playing a solo performance of Helwadi, Beautiful Girl, the song made famous by the Lebanese singer Faraous. Montasser said he believed he had been allowed to stay on the bus because he passed for a European or Anglo-American. "I am glad to be here," he said, "but I feel bad it's just because my skin is lighter, while my friends have to walk through the checkpoint." In the parking lot, Simon Hewitt-Jones, the visiting British soloist scheduled to perform the Mendelssohn that evening, stepped off the bus with his violin. Other musicians broke out their instruments, and they began jamming: violins, viola, cello, French horn, trumpet, clarinet, performed by an American, 3 Brits, a Frenchman, an Irishman, and a Palestinian. Mozart's A Little Night Music gave way to the Mendelssohn, Opus Baking in the Sun, someone quipped, then morphed into Morrison's Irish Jig, led by Johnny McBride, a fiddler from Northern Ireland. The whole tableau was set against the backdrop of gun turrets, spindly red and white surveillance towers, and the supposedly impenetrable wall. "It's pretty threatening," said McBride. "But not altogether unfamiliar. For the first half of my life, this is what Northern Ireland looked like." Plan C. Steps away, on the Ramallah side, separated by more walls of bars, the Palestinian teenagers waited in the scrum. Every so often, above the turnstile, a red light turned green, a click sounded, and 3 or 4 more people passed through to place their possessions on a conveyor belt, hold up their permits to a dull green bulletproof window, and wait as bored-looking soldiers on the other side inspected the documents and waved the permit holders through. But there were only 9 permits for 14 musicians, and those without couldn't talk their way through. And so the Ramallah 5 were turned away. They clicked their way backward through the turnstiles and cattle chute to the Ramallah side, denied Jerusalem and uncertain what to do next. They had to come up with a plan C. 1 or 2 at a time, Palestinian string players met at the bus. Soon all of them had arrived, except for the Ramallah 5. "They couldn't get through," someone said. "They said to go on to Jerusalem. They will try to join us somehow." The passengers rode south in silence for a time, wondering if the concert, in the old city on the grounds of the French Church Street, Ans, would have to be cancelled. "Hey," someone said to the musicians back on the other side, "you want to go to Jerusalem?" He sat with a group of men smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee, and nodded towards a van. "Yes," the musicians said. "You are 5? It will be 250 shekels, about $70, or $14 per musician." The man offering passage turned to his partner. "Get these guys to Jerusalem." The Ramallah 5 piled into a van. The door slid shut and the driver began working 2 phones, making arrangements. "Give me the money," he said. They haggled over the price, agreeing on 40 shekels, about $11, each. "But you have to pay now," the driver said. The man gave them his phone number, and told them to call when they reached Jerusalem. Apparently he wanted satisfied customers. A short time later the driver pulled over, stepped into a building, and emerged with a long ladder, which, when extended to its full length, reached the top of the wall. "Come," he said. The 5 musicians approached the towering slab of concrete, which reached at least 7.5 meters high. Back on the bus, the mood of the rest of the musicians was subdued. As it rolled south, it was still unclear whether the 5 musicians would somehow make it through to Jerusalem. Up and over. A string player went up the ladder first, gazing up to the top of the wall, where nasty-looking loops of razor wire presented a sharp and dangerous obstacle. But the Palestinian trafficker, who had scrambled to the top of the wall, had already cut the wire. Now, he sat beside the ladder at the top of the wall, and, with the back of his forearm, simply swept the loops of wire aside, like a curtain. They must do this all the time for illegal Palestinian workers, the musicians realized. Then the Palestinian trafficker pulled a long knotted rope from a plastic bag, looped it around a metal post at the top of the wall, and dropped it down to the other side. One by one, the young musicians mounted the ladder, sat atop the wall, grabbed the rope, and slowly slithered down, trying to use the knots as footholds. It wasn't easy, the knots were small. Halfway down, one of the string players saw a vehicle approaching on the narrow access road. He froze. Was this a soldier coming to arrest him? "Don't worry," the man called down, "it's a local Palestinian." Still, the violist began to imagine what would happen if he were arrested. From the midpoint, perhaps 4.5 meters above the ground, he fantasized about being taken to jail, and telling his fellow Palestinian inmates, to boisterous laughter, that he'd been arrested for intending to play music. Then, still sliding down the rope, he imagined the speech he would give to the judge in Israel. "Why am I guilty? The only thing that I am doing is trying to make my music for people in Jerusalem. For your information, I have learned about your suffering. I was shocked by this Israeli history. What I don't understand is why you're treating us this way." The violist thought. The hard ground at the end of the rope snapped the musician from his reverie, and he looked up to see the timpanist toss the bag of his sticks down towards him from the top of the wall. Now the violinist was coming down. But something was wrong, he was having trouble telling how far he was from the ground. He jumped too early, landing on his feet and falling hard onto his back. Everyone laughed because it seemed he was okay. From the top of the wall, the bass player tossed him his violin, in its case. Now all 5 musicians were together, on the Jerusalem side of the wall. The entire operation had taken 5 minutes. They brushed themselves off and entered a restaurant for kanaf, the pizza-shaped Palestinian dessert made of sweet cheese and pistachios. "That kanaf was very good," recalled the viola player. "Then we called to see where the bus was." Standing ovation. The Ramallah 5 appeared on the road beside the bus, smiling broadly and bounding up the steps to cheers from the orchestra. One of them showed a few of the passengers a video of the ladder, and the wall, and 2 of the musicians climbing towards the sky, proof of their deed. 20 minutes later, the orchestra arrived on the tranquil grounds of St. Anne's, a French church built during Crusader times. An old French priest welcomed them with a soft smile and a heavy accent. Tourists wandered quietly through the garden, or rested on shaded benches. A French flag flapped from the steeple. It was as if Kamandjati and the wall had never existed. The musicians disappeared into the cavernous church to rehearse Beethoven's 4th Symphony, and the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto. The sound of a violin solo drifted out, joined now by the entire orchestra, trombone, oboe, flute, and the pounding of the timpani. But the violinist who had climbed the wall fell ill, vomiting repeatedly. It was shock, a doctor told him, from the hard landing at the wall. He would not play the Old City that night. The other 36 members of the Ramallah Orchestra would, however. A little after 8 p.m., strings whispered the haunting first notes Beethoven's 4th, in a minor key, as 200 visitors filled the chairs of the old church. They had no idea what it had taken to get to Jerusalem to play Beethoven. But perhaps they sensed something. Moments after Diego Masson, the visiting French conductor, made his last thrust, and the final notes of the 4th echoed off the walls, the audience rose in a sustained, joyful ovation.